This is going to be a Life and Times of Christ oral presentation. And the topic I wanted to focus on in my paper was the resurrection of Jesus. Did the resurrection of Jesus take place? And there's many disputes over this fact. So let's go ahead and look at some of the criticisms of the resurrection, the claims that say that it didn't take place. So one of the first claims I want to take a look at is that there's people saying that there's too much variation in the Gospels, and there's inclusion of some facts in some Gospels, and then there's exclusion of those facts in other Gospels, but then the facts that are being included in some, they're not there in others. So it's too inconsistent, and we can't rely upon the Gospels. But actually, whenever we look at this through a purely just logical standpoint, we have to take into consideration that variation within accounts of eyewitness events can be expected. In a court of law, the most reliable accounts are the ones from witnesses that differ. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable due to the fact that our memories are selective and only remember what seems to be important. The other little details just simply slip into oblivion. And because of this, whenever eyewitnesses testify in court, it is normal for there to be differences. The accounts that are nearly identical are considered untrue due to the fallacy of human memory. Thus, differing accounts in the Gospels, while some have the Gospels having similarities, but at the same time having differences, speak to their reliability and their truthfulness. And the second dispute is that the disciples made up the whole resurrection, the whole shebang, and just made it up. Jesus never resurrected, he just died, dead. What they actually did was they stole the body from the tomb and claimed that Jesus had resurrected. But the assumption of the disciples making up the resurrection is absolutely ridiculous. For the disciples to have followed Jesus, who had the highest standard of ethical character, for 3 years, and then make up a story about his death, that's absurd. Not only that, if they truly would have concocted this narrative, they could not have kept it hidden between the 12 of them. One of them would have revealed the plot, either knowingly or unknowingly. And even if they desired to steal the body of Jesus, it doesn't make sense that they were able to cart the body away under the very noses of the Roman guards that were sent there to guard the tomb for that very purpose. And the noise that opening a sealed tomb with a very heavy rock in front of the entrance would have created would have certainly awakened the guards, even if the guards were drugged or sleeping extremely heavily. How could they have known that it was the disciples that stole the body? What if it was somebody else, if that was true? There is no way. And the other proof of this is, after the crucifixion of Christ, these men were depressed. We see that in the Word. They were they were just so sorrowful and mournful. And they could not have pulled off such a scheme. Men that were despondent and sad over this thing, there's no way that they could have concocted this thing. And we see another evidence of the resurrection of Jesus and the fact that they just became so alive and so on fire after 2 or so weeks of that. And so how did these men go from sorrowful and depressed to alive and on fire? They must have had a divine encounter. There's evidence of this divine encounter, this divine change that took place. Also, the pain and the suffering that they went through after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus did not make sense if they had created this whole lie. They were willing to spread the good news and die for it and give up any earthly pleasures of this process. For this to have been a lie, it's ludicrous to think it would have been a lie for them to have suffered so much for the cause of Christ. Another argument that has been presented is that the tomb was never visited between the 2 months of Jesus' death and ascension, that Jesus only appeared to the disciples in a spiritual form. But we see that God, of course, whenever he was doing these miracles, he had the power to raise several people from the dead. It's only logical to believe that he had the power given to him by the Spirit of God to resurrect themselves. himself. So, and also whenever he appeared to them, and he said, "Feel my hands, see my hands, see my feet," and Thomas reached into my side and touched me. Thomas couldn't have touched Jesus if he was just a spirit and just appeared to him in that spiritual form. And another theory that they have, that they put out there, is that the Roman or Jewish authorities removed the body, and they just tricked the disciples into thinking that he had actually resurrected. But if it was true that the authorities had removed the body, then what did they do with it? And if they had the body of Jesus in their possession, then why didn't they just present it to the people to prove that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, and that all this news that the disciples were spreading around was simply false? But they didn't have the body. It wasn't there, or else they would have done it. Another thing that people have concocted, and that this argument that they have come up with, is that the women in the morning, they went to the wrong tomb. But we see that this is simply not true, because Mary Magdalene at first assumed that Jesus was a gardener, and she could not have assumed that if she couldn't have seen him. Also, Peter and John came to that same tomb in broad daylight, and this is evident by the fact that they could see the grave clothes inside of this tomb that was inside of the cave. And if it wouldn't have been daylight, then there would have been no possible way to see that cave. So that is just simply not true. And if the authorities had tried to trick the disciples into believing that this was the right tomb by staging everything and pretending that this was the right tomb, putting grave clothes there, then why didn't they just present the body? But they couldn't have. Because again, they did not have it. Jesus indeed had resurrected. Another theory out there is that Joseph of Arimathea took the body. But this simply could not be true as well, because it doesn't make any sense. Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple of Jesus. To have hidden the body from the other disciples, to make them believe that Jesus had risen, it doesn't have any, a factual basis. It doesn't have any logical sense to that. And if he wasn't a disciple of Jesus, then why didn't he just present the body to squelch the story? And, he had no time to take the body. He was a devout Jew and would not have violated the Sabbath to steal a body. And by the next morning, we see that the women are already there. So he simply had no time. If he wouldn't have been a disciple, he would have presented the body. And if he wasn't truly a disciple, then he wouldn't have hidden it from the others. Another theory is that the appearances were mistaken identity. This post-death experiences that the disciples encountered were just all mistakenly that they looked like Jesus. And this is supposedly supported by the instances of the disciples and Mary making Jesus out for a different person. But if that were true, then why did every time that the disciples and Mary and they saw Jesus, why did they not, they left with no doubt in their mind? So it had to have been him. Every time that they accidentally mistook Jesus for someone else, he always proved to them that it was him by his scars, his ability to teach, by their touching him, his voice, or his miracles. And this convinced them. They left with no doubt in their mind that this was the same person that they had known and loved. Also, this theory does not explain the empty tomb. If Jesus had not resurrected in his exalted body, then once again, why did the Jewish officials just go to the tomb, take out the body, and prove that the disciples were wrong? The fact that Jesus did resurrect in a physical glorified body that the disciples could feel and see does not give place to the fact of him just being in a spiritual sense, or of them having mistaken identity. Also, it would have been impossible to fool all the people that Jesus appeared to after the resurrection. He appeared to over 500 people on 11 different occasions over a 40-day period. It is much more logical to believe in a physical divine resurrection than to think that his identity was mistaken by all these people. And the last claim that we're going to examine here is that some people claim that God destroyed the body. And this view says that God made the body disappear. Or some people say that the appearances were theophany-like. Others say that Jesus assumed a bodily form, and the scars were replicas. They convinced the disciples of his reality, but not of his materiality. But these claims are obviously false, because Jesus said earlier on in his ministry that he would destroy this temple, this physical body, and raise it, this same physical body, in 3 days. If he wouldn't have resurrected in his glorified form of his physical body, that would mean that Jesus had lied. And this cannot be true, because Jesus said that, it said in the Word that there was no sin in him, and to make him a deceiver would be sinful. So taking into this consideration, we know that he could not have done this. God bless y'all. I hope y'all have a great evening.